Now, over the course of the last 1 month, Kiev has turned the tide of the war in Ukraine, and this has happened right from the first week of September. And Ukraine has pushed with its advance ever since and has reportedly regained at least about 9,000 square kilometers of its territory from the Russians. And in the latest, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has declared that a key logistics hub of Lyman in eastern Ukraine has been completely cleared of Moscow's troops. And this comes just a day after the Russian troops also admitted that they are retreating from a town because of having been completely encircled by the Ukrainian troops. And this is being seen as one of Kiev's most significant victories in the battlefield. Now, the victory could, of course, provide a staging post for further gains in the east. The Luhansk governor has said that the regain of Lyman will be a key factor in the further deoccupation of the neighboring Luhansk region. Now, this, of course, is a video that's been posted by the Ukrainian Defense Forces where they say that they've taken off the Russians from the town of Lyman, and the American Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has cheered the Ukrainian advance, saying that it was very encouraging to see the Ukrainians gaining in the battlefield. He also said that the loss of logistics and transport hub will, of course, pose a new dilemma for Russian military. And confirming the development, Russia has said that its troops had withdrawn from Lyman to avoid being completely surrounded by the Ukrainian army. Remember, this, of course, happened just a day after Moscow, amidst much fanfare, had declared the annexation of the 4 regions of Ukraine, including Donetsk, although they don't even control 60% of Donetsk. Now, Lyman happens to be a key town in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, and Russia recently annexed Donetsk following a referendum. 3 other regions in Ukraine's east and south were also annexed by Russia. And Russia's constitutional court has recognized the annexation treaties as lawful. Now, Russia's hurried referendums and annexation also reflects Moscow's limited options on the battlefield. As of now, Russia has reportedly lost more than it could gain in Ukraine in the course of the last 1 month. Russia has also failed to make any kind of major gains in the battlefield since the first week of September. And Putin's partial mobilization orders also belies the military superiority of the Russian forces. Ukraine's tough resistance on the ground and the continuous support from the West has in fact put Vladimir Putin in a bit of a tough spot. What Russia does now, of course, remains to be seen, but it can be asserted without any doubt that the war has turned well away from the side of the Russians, and it is the Ukrainians who, of course, seem to be making some pretty important gains on the battlefield. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of the progress that Ukrainian forces have been making, we are being joined by Mr. William Bishop, who's a senior journalist who's joining us live from Kiev. Now, Mr. Bishop, this of course is a pretty remarkable turnaround that Ukraine has in fact effected. The first 6 months of the war, it was all one-way traffic by the Russians. The Russians had outgunned and outflanked the Ukrainian forces, but in the course of the last 4 weeks, the Ukrainians have turned things on their head. And with the capture of the city of Lyman, this is going to be a pretty big blow for the Russians.
Yes, that's correct. This is a major operational defeat for the Russian military by the Ukrainian armed forces. And while it isn't yet clear how many Russians were killed or captured in the retaking of this pocket in Lyman, independent analysts estimate that it is in the thousands. Now, I was outside of Lyman in June observing the Russian offensive, and I can tell you that it was a very brutal and very costly battle for both the Ukrainians and the Russians. So in addition to being a devastating blow to Russian morale to have lost the city now, it also allows the Ukrainians to continue offensive operations across this area of Luhansk and to threaten Russian positions in the major city of Severodonetsk and elsewhere further east.
Now, what do you think has actually changed on the ground? Because, till about a month back, we'd been hearing from the Ukrainians that they were outgunned by the Russians. The Russians had better artillery that they were using to great effect against the Ukrainian forces. What do you think is the reason behind these spectacular gains that Ukraine now seems to be making?
Well, I think that what we're seeing come into play is really the idea of quality versus quantity. So the Russians have really relied on massed firepower and superiority of numbers to gain territory throughout the course of the war. Over the past several months, the Ukrainians have been able to use and employ effective, superior weapons being provided to them by the West, such as precision artillery. And they've really been able to take the initiative away from the Russians through better tactics and better weaponry. So it's worth noting that about 3 weeks ago, the even more important logistics node of Kupiansk was retaken by Ukrainian forces as part of this sweeping counteroffensive in in Kharkiv. So what we have here is now is kind of a domino effect. As one defensive position falls, it creates opportunities for the attacker, in this case the Ukrainians, to pick and choose further targets and exploit Russian weaknesses in their lines.
Absolutely. And also the fact that the town of Lyman has fallen to the Ukrainians just a day, less than 24 hours after the Russian President Vladimir Putin went on and said that he had annexed these 4 regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, and the other 2 territories. But what is interesting is in the region of Donetsk, the Russians don't even control 60% of the entire of that province. So what is the mood within Ukraine like, where Russia seems to be claiming territory that it has annexed, where it does not even have any presence?
Well, it really shows the difference between signing a piece of paper and actually making battlefield gains. Anyone in Ukraine will tell you that they will not stop fighting. They will continue resisting the Russians and the Russian invasion. So regardless of what Moscow declares to have done in terms of annexing or illegally annexing territory within Ukraine, it doesn't actually change anything on the battlefield in either the east or in the south, where Russian forces now have again lost the initiative. They're being pushed by Ukrainian forces, and in many cases they are on the defensive. Right. And this is part of why the mobilization order that Vladimir Putin announced last week, about 2 weeks ago, why it will play such a key role in the months moving ahead, because as Russia begins to bring greater numbers to the battlefield, Ukraine will also have to find a way to mitigate that and to apply their superior weapons and tactics to stop Russia from holding territory or making any further gains.
Very interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. William Bishop, for joining us and getting us all those insights there from Kiev. We, of course, need to see as to what unfolds on the battlefield in the course of the next couple of weeks now.
Thank you.
And also to give us insights in terms of, is there a possibility of negotiation, and how will the war in fact progress from here on, considering that Russia is clearly on the back foot in the battlefield, but Vladimir Putin has of course made his grandstanding announcement that he has annexed 4 key regions from eastern Ukraine. How will this now play out from here? We are being joined in by Mr. William Courtney. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Global think tank. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Courtney, this is a very critical moment in this war, because Vladimir Putin has upped the stakes now. He's claimed these 4 Ukrainian territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson as part of now Russian territory. The Ukrainians are fighting Vladimir Putin's forces there. And considering the fact that the Russians are now clearly on the back foot, do you think this is the moment, because Russia is now in a corner, that Vladimir Putin may in fact considering doing something that a lot of people have been predicting for a long time, and that is to use some kind of a low-grade nuclear weapon? Is that a possibility that you even think of?
It is unlikely that Russia would turn to that step. Nuclear weapons have not been used in combat for over 70 years. There's a strong nuclear barrier that is developed in the global consciousness, which is, if you will, reflected in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has over 190 countries that adhere to the treaty. So I think Russia would think hard about that. And certainly China and India, 2 countries that Russia has turned to for help because of its isolation from the West. Certainly from what we saw in the meeting in Samarkand a couple of weeks ago, they would not be supportive of this. I would imagine China would be quite critical.
Of course, would support anything like this. But Mr. Courtney, the reason why I asked this question is because murmurs of using a low-grade nuclear weapon have in fact been made within Russia. The Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has said that because the war is not going well for the Russians, he has asked the Russian president to in fact step in with some much more harder measures. And he suggested that the way the Russians can in fact do this is by using some kind of a low-grade nuclear weapon. This is a murmur within the corridors of power from people who are close to Vladimir Putin himself?
Well, President Putin himself has talked about this kind of thing. And in 2018, he showed a big video on television of a nuclear-armed cruise missile striking Florida. But this would still be something that would isolate Russia from the international community far more so than it has been. And the problem that the Russian military faces is it may not have the conventional forces which are able to exploit any tactical nuclear weapon used on the battlefield.
And Mr. Courtney, you've been watching the way Vladimir Putin conducts his diplomacy for a long time. So the question that I want to ask you is, what is the logic behind going on and announcing that Russia has now annexed these eastern regions of Ukraine, especially in territories like Donetsk and also in Zaporizhia? Large parts of these regions are not even controlled by the Russians. What do you think is Vladimir Putin's strategy by saying that these are now a part of Mother Russia?
Well, it appears that the Kremlin thinks that the West and Ukraine might back off from attacking those areas once they are theoretically annexed to Russia. But Ukraine and the West have made quite clear for weeks that that is not the case, that Ukraine will still continue to attack those targets. And indeed, of course, yesterday it seized the city of Lyman, a city of about 25,000 people in an area that had been controlled by Russia. So it was a foolish risk that the Kremlin took, because the Kremlin looks more awkward now, or embarrassed, if you will, having lost a city of that size just a day after President Putin proceeded with the annexation.
Absolutely, indeed. And my last question to you, Mr. Courtney, is, the Russian president has been saying that the reason why he's been required to carry out what he describes as a special operation in Ukraine is because of the expansion of NATO's frontiers ever eastwards, closer to the borders of Russia. Do you think this is an issue with which Washington would like to negotiate with Vladimir Putin?
No. It has been quite clear for some time, including in President Putin's long essay about Ukraine a year and a half ago, that the existence of an independent Ukraine is the main issue for the ultranationalists in Russia and for the Kremlin. So we have seen the propaganda talk about how Ukraine really should not exist, never existed in Russian history before as an independent country. So this runs much deeper than NATO expansion. It's not even clear NATO expansion plays any role in Russia's decision-making on this.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. William Courtney, for joining us and getting us all those insights there.
You're welcome.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.